The Supreme Court chamber fell into utter silence. What had just occurred was unlike anything witnessed in recent judicial history. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, a towering figure on America's highest court, had interrupted Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett during a pivotal hearing. Yet it was Jasmine's composed and razor-sharp reply that left everyone beneath those massive marble columns stunned. Tensions had been brewing for months. Still, neither the seasoned justices, nor the crowded spectator section, nor even the experienced legal journalists anticipated what was about to happen. In under 60 seconds, one of the rising stars of the Democratic Party was set to challenge the Supreme Court's own perception of its role. Justice Sotomayor's stunned reaction would reverberate throughout Washington's political heart. An electric buzz filled the air, thick with anticipation and strain. People who had queued up since sunrise knew they weren't merely witnessing another dry legal dispute. They were about to observe something historic. Up in the gallery, law professors exchanged glances, sensing this might become a future case study. Veteran reporters grabbed their pens, fully aware they were about to craft headlines destined for the history books. But before we break down this explosive encounter that's igniting the internet, be sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a moment of what's being called one of the most gripping political showdowns in recent years. This story has everything: power struggles, courtroom suspense, and two brilliant women refusing to back down in America's most revered legal arena. This wasn't an ordinary legal skirmish. It was a battle between two generations of Democratic leadership, each armed with a lifetime of insight and commitment. And what Jasmine Crockett said next might very well define her political future, for better or worse. At 70, Justice Sotomayor has been a pivotal figure on the court's liberal flank for years. Appointed in 2009 by President Obama, she became the first Latina to serve on the Supreme Court, renowned for her sharp intellect and outspoken dissents. She's built a legacy of championing voting rights, immigration reform, and justice system fairness. Growing up in the Bronx with Puerto Rican roots, her journey took her from public housing to Princeton and then to Yale Law School. Before joining the Supreme Court, she worked as a prosecutor, corporate attorney, and federal judge. For more than a decade, she's been known for challenging lawyers with probing, incisive questions, and she's earned deep respect for it. Yet this time, the person facing her wasn't a nervous attorney. It was Representative Jasmine Crockett. At only 43, Crockett has emerged as a prominent voice in the new wave of Democratic politics. Hailing from Texas, the Congresswoman has made an impression online and in congressional hearings, refusing to shy away from contentious debates. Her legal career was forged in defending those with little power, years as a public defender giving her profound insight into how the justice system affects everyday lives. And now, that courtroom experience was about to be tested in the nation's highest court. Representing a district that spans parts of Dallas, Crockett has become known for her bluntness, her willingness to call out hypocrisy, and her refusal to let political theatrics go unchallenged. Her combination of courtroom skill and social media savvy has elevated her into national political conversations. In Congress, she's drawn headlines for her direct questioning of CEOs and top officials, often leaving them scrambling for answers. Younger voters view her as someone who doesn't play by the old rules. And that's precisely why today's hearing stood apart. The case was Henderson v. Texas, a crucial voting rights battle with ramifications across the nation. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, Crockett received the rare chance to participate in oral arguments alongside Department of Justice lawyers. Some considered this unprecedented, others argued it was overdue. The stakes were monumental. The court's ruling could either preserve voting access for millions or grant states greater freedom to redraw voting districts in ways that suppress minority voices. For Justice Sotomayor, the case struck at the core of her convictions. For Crockett, it symbolized nothing less than the preservation of American democracy. Neither woman was prepared to concede. For weeks, debates had swirled through legal circles about whether a sitting member of Congress should be allowed to argue before the court. Critics dismissed it as political spectacle. Supporters viewed it as a necessary evolution, a sign that elected officials could participate directly in shaping constitutional debates. Behind the scenes, Sotomayor reportedly voiced unease about breaking long-held protocol. Having devoted her career to rising through the formal ranks of the legal profession, she held the court's traditions in deep regard. Meanwhile, Crockett had been preparing for months. She pored over past voting rights cases, memorized critical precedents, and trained with constitutional experts. She knew that some justices, even those considered liberal, might see her presence as crossing a line, but she was ready. The stage was set for a fierce clash between established legal customs and an incoming wave of generational change. Yet what no one foresaw was just how personal it would become. As the Supreme Court chamber filled, an unusual energy rippled through the space. Everyone present could feel it. The towering marble columns seemed to lean forward, listening. Even veteran journalists who had attended hundreds of court sessions admitted this day felt different. Justice Sotomayor assumed her seat on the bench with her trademark composure, although those who knew her well noticed subtle tension in her posture. Privately, she'd expressed discomfort over this highly unusual arrangement. Then came Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her arrival turned heads not only for who she was, but for the way she carried herself. Wearing a crisp navy suit, she stood out from the crowd of gray-suited attorneys. Her presence wasn't flashy, it was intentional. It transformed the courtroom's atmosphere. Chief Justice Roberts opened the session with the usual formalities, but from the instant Crockett began speaking, it was obvious this would be no ordinary hearing. "Your Honors," she began, her voice steady and assured, the voice of someone who had stood before many benches. "I am here not merely as a legislator, but as someone who has witnessed firsthand what these laws mean for ordinary people whose voices hinge on this court's decision." Justice Thomas leaned forward, an uncommon gesture. Justice Alito's pen stopped mid-sentence. Justice Barrett, typically focused on her notes, lifted her gaze. But it was Justice Sotomayor's reaction that drew attention, a subtle tightening of her jaw, a single tap of her fingers on the bench. Anyone familiar with her body language knew exactly what it meant. Disagreement. As Crockett pressed on, she delivered a meticulous argument about constitutional guarantees of fair representation. Questions came quickly. Justice Kavanaugh challenged her interpretation of prior decisions. Justice Gorsuch pushed back on her understanding of the balance between state and federal power. Yet Crockett held her ground, calmly citing legal precedents, quoting past rulings, and presenting her logic with the precision of someone who wasn't just politically engaged, but rigorously trained in the law. This wasn't a politician putting on a show in court. This was a lawyer who also happened to hold elected office, and she'd come prepared. Then Justice Alito spoke up. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said sharply, "are you proposing this court should discard decades of precedent purely because of your political views?" The tension snapped like a wire. It was the kind of question meant to rattle even seasoned litigators. Crockett paused. Then she smiled. Not a forced grin, nor one born of nerves, but the confident smile of someone who'd been waiting for precisely this moment. "With all due respect, Justice Alito," she answered firmly, "I am not asking this court to rewrite precedent. I'm asking you to interpret it correctly. Equal protection under the law is not and should never be a political opinion." A few muted gasps echoed through the gallery. It was rare for anyone to speak to the justices with such unflinching directness. But Crockett refused to yield. As her time continued, she began weaving in personal accounts from her own districts, stories of voters pushed aside, communities fractured by redistricting, and the tangible effects of past rulings on real people's lives. "This isn't some abstract theory," she declared, her voice gaining power. "Every time voting rights are chipped away, real people lose their voice in this democracy. In my district, this isn't just a policy issue, it's a lived reality." That was when Justice Sotomayor interjected. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice suddenly cutting through the chamber like a blade, "this courtroom is not a stage for political theatrics. It is a forum for legal argument, not storytelling or anecdotes." The room froze. Even the court stenographer momentarily glanced up. Justice Sotomayor pressed on, her tone now even firmer. "You are here to discuss constitutional arguments, nothing further. Personal stories and political appeals have no place in this courtroom." Her words fell like a lightning strike. Later, journalists would say they'd never witnessed anything like it, a liberal justice chastising a liberal advocate before the entire country. Crockett stood motionless. For an instant, it seemed the weight of the public scolding might make her buckle. But then, she did the last thing anyone expected. She smiled once more, but this time, the smile wasn't reflexive. It was intentional, a quiet, self-assured signal that she knew precisely where she wanted this to go. Justice Sotomayor, she said softly, her voice controlled and polite. I say this with deep respect for the court and for your tremendous contributions to the law, but I have to disagree. A murmur swept through the gallery. Was a member of Congress truly challenging a sitting Supreme Court justice out loud? Crockett edged forward, shoulders squared, voice firm. You've said personal experiences don't belong here. But weren't personal stories exactly what shaped some of this court's most historic rulings? Wasn't Linda Brown's journey at the heart of Brown v. Board of Education? Didn't Gideon's personal ordeal lead to the right to counsel? Justice Sotomayor remained still, her face impassive. Yet, keen observers noticed her fingers tighten slightly around her pen. Crockett pressed on, still respectful. Your own confirmation hearings were filled with powerful personal accounts, your struggles with diabetes, your mother's sacrifices, the ways your own life molded your view of justice. Were those details irrelevant to whether you were fit to serve on this court? The room fell utterly silent. Only the gentle drone of the air conditioning broke the stillness. Even Chief Justice Roberts, known for swiftly restoring decorum, stayed motionless. What was unfolding defied every norm. Crockett wasn't done. She stepped closer, her voice now resonant with not only legal expertise but the unmistakable authority of an elected leader. With the utmost respect, she said, I need to remind the court that I'm not standing here only as an attorney. I'm the elected representative of 760,000 Americans who entrusted me to speak on their behalf. Even in rooms like this one. She glanced toward the gallery, where several of her constituents sat, riveted. Many of them never attended Ivy League universities. They can't recite constitutional precedent from memory, but they know when something feels unjust, and they chose me to speak up for them even here. Justice Sotomayor leaned a fraction forward, seemingly ready to interject, but Crockett raised a steady, open hand, not aggressive, but resolute. Your Honor, she said, if this institution believes that lived experience has no place in interpreting the Constitution, then perhaps it's time we ask whether this court still sees the people it exists to serve. Her words struck with force a question destined to echo long after the hearing adjourned. A sitting congresswoman had just publicly questioned whether the Supreme Court remained in touch with those whose lives its decisions affect. Chief Justice Roberts finally stepped in. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, seeking to re-establish order, please confine your statements to the legal issues before the court. But the moment had already grown into something far bigger. In less than 2 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had turned a public reprimand into a direct challenge of the court's role and relevance. Justice Sotomayor appeared visibly shaken, her face unreadable, but her lips pressed into a tense line. It was an unfamiliar position for one of the court's most esteemed justices. Not a debate over legal doctrines, but a confrontation over the deeper mission of judicial power itself. She leaned back slightly in her chair, studying Crockett with piercing focus. Then, speaking slowly, each word measured, she said, Congresswoman Crockett, are you implying that this court should let public sentiment dictate constitutional law? It was a trapper question meant to corner Crockett. Answer yes, and she could be accused of undermining judicial neutrality. Answer no, and her own argument risked collapse. But Crockett didn't pause. She'd faced loaded questions her entire legal career, from skeptical judges to fierce cross-examiners. This was no different. Standing tall, she replied calmly and unfazed, I'm saying that if constitutional interpretation ignores how laws affect actual human beings, then it's not interpretation at all. It's abstract theory without substance. It's legal philosophy detached from the people it's supposed to protect. Her words were so unexpected, so bold, that even Justice Thomas, who'd been quiet throughout, looked up from his papers. Crockett continued, gesturing toward the towering portrait of Chief Justice John Marshall hanging overhead. This court has the authority to interpret the Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't belong solely to the court. It belongs to the people. And when this court hands down rulings that systematically silence certain voices in our democracy, it doesn't uphold the Constitution, it betrays it. She let her words hang in the air, then continued. John Marshall didn't establish judicial review so the courts could hover above the public. He established it to keep the Constitution living and meaningful for every American, just for those with law degrees or political influence. Justice Sotomayor's cheeks flushed a deeper hue. No one could quite discern whether it was irritation, embarrassment, or a mix of emotions. But Crockett pressed on. "Your Honor," she said more gently now, "you've written beautifully about how growing up in the Bronx, your mother's sacrifices, your personal challenges, especially with your health shaped your perception of justice." The words seemed to catch Sotomayor off guard. Her stern expression softened, if only slightly. Crockett pressed the point. "I believe you when you say diversity enriches the wisdom of this court. But if a justice's personal journey matters in shaping the law, why shouldn't the lived experiences of everyday Americans matter when interpreting it? Why is your background valid, but theirs inadmissible?" The power of her argument lay not just in the substance, but in her delivery. She had skillfully turned Sotomayor's own judicial philosophy into a mirror, and it was working. Across the bench, justices who had remained quiet began leaning forward, sensing the conversation had shifted into deeper, even historic territory, adjusted her posture, clearly preparing to answer fully. But before she could respond, Crockett took one final step. "Your Honor," she said, pulling a small card from her jacket pocket. "This is the oath I took when I entered Congress." She read aloud in a clear, calm voice. "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." Then she lifted her gaze to the bench. "That same Constitution which grants you the power to interpret the law gives me the responsibility to speak for my constituents. And when you tell me their stories don't belong in this courtroom, it's not only me you're silencing, it's them." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the chamber could feel it. This was no longer merely a courtroom debate. It had become a profound reckoning, a confrontation about democracy itself, about power, and about who truly holds it. Justice Kavanaugh leaned forward, attempting to steer the hearing back to procedural ground. "Congresswoman, perhaps we could return to discussing the legal framework of this case." But Crockett turned to him, calm and steady. "Justice Kavanaugh, that is the legal framework. The fundamental constitutional question here is whether every American's voice counts equally, and whether this court will protect that principle or let it be gradually erased." Then, without raising her voice, she added, "And the human question, which I'd argue is equally vital, is whether this court still remembers who it serves." What was unfolding wasn't merely legal, it was deeply human. But Congresswoman Crockett wasn't finished yet. "At the core of every legal argument we're discussing," she said, "is a question we can't separate. Will the people I represent be afforded the same democratic weight as citizens in wealthier, more powerful districts?" Justice Sotomayor had stayed silent for much of the exchange. Now, she leaned forward again. Her voice, when she finally spoke, lacked the earlier sternness. It was softer, almost probing. "Congresswoman Crockett," she asked, "what precisely are you asking this court to do?" It was the opening Crockett had been waiting for, the chance to pivot from merely defending herself to defining the stakes. "Justice Sotomayor," she began, her voice unwavering, "I'm asking this court to remember why constitutional principles exist at all. They exist to serve real people living real lives." She moved closer to the lectern, her voice growing firmer with every word. "When this Supreme Court chips away at protections for voting rights, it's not merely tweaking legal doctrines, it's choosing who holds power in America, who has a voice, and who gets left behind." Then came the instant that would be replayed on every news network for days on end. Jasmine Crockett fixed her eyes on Justice Sotomayor, not speaking lawyer to judge, but woman to woman. "Justice Sotomayor," she said softly, "your whole life has been dedicated to breaking down barriers. You've shown that intelligence wears many faces, and that our institutions grow stronger when they truly reflect the entire country. You proved that a girl from the Bronx could rise to the highest court in the land and make it better." Something shifted across the justice's expression, her usual stern demeanor melting into something far more human and exposed. "All I'm asking," Crockett continued, "is that you extend that same faith to the everyday people whose fates end up before this bench. They might not speak the language of the law, but they know justice. They might not quote past rulings, but they recognize when they're being overlooked. And they deserve to be heard, not just at the voting booth, but right here, in the courtrooms where their futures are determined." Justice Sotomayor leaned back, silent for what felt like an eternity. The entire chamber seemed frozen, hanging on the edge of her next words. One of the sharpest legal minds in America was visibly grappling with what had just been said. At last, she spoke, her voice suddenly more intimate and searching. Congresswoman Crockett, she replied carefully, you've given this court a lot to consider. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was something unprecedented, Supreme Court Justice acknowledging that perhaps she'd judged too quickly. Justice Sotomayor went on, saying, maybe the true issue isn't whether personal experiences have a place in constitutional analysis, but how we balance them against our duty to the law. The moment sent shockwaves through legal circles. Reporters in the press gallery were already hammering away at their keyboards. Law professors texted colleagues in disbelief. Even veteran court watchers stared, stunned, but Crockett wasn't about to let it end there. With profound respect, she told the justice, that kind of balance doesn't happen by shutting people out. It happens by welcoming more voices in. Then she delivered the line that would define the entire confrontational line splashed across headlines, social media, and press conferences for weeks. This court's legitimacy doesn't come from standing apart from the people. It comes from standing with them, and you cannot serve the people you refuse to hear. A hush swept over the chamber so heavy it almost buzzed in the ears. Justice Sotomayor stared back at her, unmoving, thoughtful, transformed. And then, slowly, the justice gave the slightest nod. Point taken. Congresswoman, please proceed with your argument. In that instant, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. In the space of 10 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had transformed what began as a sharp rebuke into one of the Supreme Court's most electrifying lessons in constitutional dialogue, and one of the court's most senior justices had, in her own subtle way, admitted she'd been deeply moved. As Crockett concluded her remarks and stepped away from the lectern, the room practically vibrated with tension and awe. Something extraordinary had just occurred, a moment of raw reckoning, legal, human, and political, unfolding before an entire nation. Journalists scrambled to file breaking reports. Legal experts huddled, whispering fervently, in the public gallery. Some observers simply sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb what they'd witnessed. Justice Sotomayor remained on the bench for the rest of the day's cases, but those watching closely noticed a distinct shift in her demeanor. She still pressed lawyers with tough questions, but now she spoke with a deeper curiosity, showing a renewed willingness to consider the human stories behind each case. By the time Chief Justice Roberts banged the gavel to adjourn, the normally measured exit had become organized chaos. Reporters raced for the exits. Legal scholars clustered in the hallways, dissecting every word. It was clear this was no ordinary court session. Something seismic had happened. Within minutes, #Crockett VSO to Mayor was trending across social platforms. Legal Twitter erupted with commentary. Harvard professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, in 40 years observing SCOTUS, I've never seen anything like Jasmine Crockett directly challenging a sitting justice on constitutional principles. Brilliant, necessary. Many admired the courage it took for Congresswoman Crockett to speak up. Confronting the highest court in America is not something most politicians would even dare. But Crockett didn't. It sent ripples through the entire legal and political world. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries hailed the moment as a masterclass in constitutional dialogue and democratic bravery. Law schools around the nation swiftly integrated the exchange into their courses. The National Bar Association praised both women Crockett and Justice Sotomayor for showing how sharp disagreements between powerful figures can still elevate public debate. Former Solicitor General Donald Verrilli offered a striking perspective. This, he said, wasn't the collapse of institutions, which was growth. Crockett didn't tear the system down. She forced it to confront questions it had long tried to avoid. 3 days after the hearing, Justice Sotomayor spoke at a judicial conference in Chicago, delivering remarks that stunned the legal community. I was reminded, she said, that our responsibility is not just to interpret the law from above, but to remember whom the law exists to serve. That requires not only legal expertise but humility. Coming from a sitting Supreme Court justice, those words were viewed as a rare, public acknowledgement that Congresswoman Crockett's challenge had truly struck a chord. Legal scholars began asking whether this could become a new model for how lawmakers engage with the judiciary, not as subordinates, but as co-equal partners in shaping constitutional meaning. In The Atlantic, Professor Aki Lamar wrote, Crockett treated the court as a co-equal branch of government, not as a temple above criticism. That's precisely what the Constitution intended. The encounter ignited a nationwide debate. Was the Supreme Court too insulated from public accountability? How much respectful pushback should Congress be willing or even expected to offer? Law schools reported a surge in applications from students citing the hearing as their inspiration. Several members of Congress even announced plans to pursue law degrees, and the Supreme Court itself responded. New measures were adopted to make hearings more accessible and transparent, including better live streaming and clearer language during oral arguments. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine Crockett's profile soared. She evolved from a rising political figure to a household name. Over 50,000 emails flooded her office from people nationwide. Invitations poured in for her to speak at universities, legal panels, and civic events. "I've heard from teachers using the video in civics classes," Crockett told CNN, "from law students who feel emboldened to take on tough cases, from ordinary people who simply feel seen." What began as a confrontation transformed into something greater. Reports soon surfaced that Crockett and Justice Sotomayor had developed a respectful professional relationship. Just 3 weeks later, the two were spotted deep in private conversation at a judicial policy conference. A source revealed Sotomayor told Crockett, "You challenge me to be better. That's what public service is all about." Legal historians are already placing this moment alongside other pivotal confrontations in Supreme Court history. Georgetown professor Randy Barnett remarked, "Crockett reminded the judiciary that its legitimacy flows from the consent of the governed. That's not rebellion, that's democracy." And the effect lingered. In the sessions that followed, observers noticed Sotomayor posing sharper, more practical questions, focused on the real-life consequences of the court's decisions. Meanwhile, Crockett used her rising influence to champion civic education and to encourage closer collaboration between Congress and the judiciary. This wasn't just a fiery headline. It marked a shift in how Americans think about power, justice, and who deserves to be heard. Crockett proved that respecting institutions doesn't mean staying silent, and Sotomayor showed that true judicial strength lies in the willingness to listen, learn, and grow. Together, they demonstrated what's possible when two powerful forces engage each other with respect but without fear, in an era often marked by division and suspicion. Their exchange reminded the country of something precious. Even the most powerful figures can evolve, reflect, and embody the democratic values they serve. What unfolded in those 10 minutes will echo through legal and political circles for years to come, because it exposed one undeniable truth: no institution, however revered, should ever be above respectful challenge from the people it was built to serve. And Jasmine Crockett made it clear: Justice Sotomayor, you're finished. Make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the moments shaking American politics and law.